Hey everyone, I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. This is a series where we take a deep dive into the research on Psilocybin, the psychedelic prodrug found in magic mushrooms. We'll be breaking down and discussing the scientific literature, one study at a time, from past to present. Today is a special day because we get 2 episodes. I recently came into some additional free time, and I'm really glad to get to spend it on the podcast. This episode is on the article titled Experimental Psychiatry, Psilocybin, a New Psychotogenic Drug, published in 1960. The researchers of the study came from the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, Harvard Medical School, Boston University, and Northwestern University. I really enjoy seeing where these studies are done, partly because for me, it's almost shocking to see how many universities at one point had been doing research on psilocybin. I'm really hopeful that soon we will see more of these institutions pick up where they left off and continue to push forward into psychedelic research. Now, this is a rather brief case study, so apologies if the episode is a bit shorter than usual. Similar to episode 2 of the podcast, the researchers primarily described the qualitative symptoms that were seen in volunteers administered psilocybin. In this case, there were 4 male volunteers who were each given between 5 and 10 milligrams of psilocybin. They don't provide any description for the participants, except that they stated that they had taken psychotropic drugs in previous experiments. Given the unethical practices of human experimentation that we talked about during episode 1, it's really unclear if these were true volunteers or not, so that's important to keep in mind when interpreting the results. I'm hopeful, though, that since this research was conducted by university faculty as opposed to a government researcher, they were actually volunteers. On that note, I actually also want to mention that it's likely many of the early studies we discuss on this show will have severely limited generalizability, either because of flaws in the methodology or simply the exploratory nature of the research being done at the time. The goal of going over these first few studies is primarily to understand the genealogy of the research into psilocybin and to start generating our own hypotheses that we can think about as we progress into reviewing more modern research. Before going further into the methodology of this particular case study, I want to bring up one of the points they made in their introduction. Although the introduction was very brief, they mention, unfortunately without proper citation, that one experiment found that up to 200 milligrams per kilogram of body weight was unable to produce a lethal effect in mice. They said, quote, "The absolute toxicity in terms of the LD50 could not as yet be determined because of the limited supply of the drug." Now, LD50 stands for the dose that produces a lethal effect 50% of the time. As mentioned in episode 1, there is evidence that places the LD50 for psilocybin at about 270 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, meaning someone who weighed about 70 kilograms would need about 19,000 milligrams of psilocybin to have a 50-50 chance of fatally overdosing. Although there is a lot of variation in terms of psilocybin concentration found in mushrooms, a rough order of magnitude estimate is that there's about 10 milligrams of psilocybin per gram of dried mushrooms. So someone who weighed 70 kilograms, or about 155 pounds, would theoretically need to consume about 1,900 grams, or 67 ounces of dried mushrooms. So now that we've had that little tangent, let's get back to the case study. As I mentioned, there were 4 male volunteers who came to the Massachusetts Medical Health Center and were placed in a quiet room with the, quote, Venetian blinds closed. Throughout the experiment, they were under the observation of a psychiatrist and 3 psychologists, which personally seems like a lot. When I was in therapy more regularly, just having one psychiatrist, in addition to my personality, in a room together made it feel very crowded. So I can't imagine tripping with 4 doctors in the room all analyzing my behavior. Now I want to start the results section the same way the researchers do, because their opening line is priceless. They say, quote, "First of all, it may be stated that our observations confirmed that the drug is active." As if there was possibly any doubt. The researchers then described the overall time course for the drug's effect. The first effects were seen after about 30 to 45 minutes, with peak effects being achieved about an hour after administration and lasted 3 to 4 hours. They then said that participants felt competent to go about their routine activities after about 6 to 8 hours, although noted that they didn't think the participants returned to pre-experimental conditions until about 16 hours after administration. When I read this, I immediately wanted to know if they just kept them in a room for 16 hours to make this observation, because that seems incredibly uncomfortable. Unlike the participants mentioned in episode 2, these 4 did not report any side effects like headaches or fatigue after the experiment. This might have been impacted by the fact that the maximum dose in this study was 10 milligrams, whereas it was 36 in the previous study. It'll be important to keep this dose in mind when understanding the rest of the results. When it came to reported symptoms, none of the participants reported hallucinations and only one reported illusions. As we discussed in a prior episode, a hallucination is when you see something that has no existing stimulus, and an illusion is when you see a distorted version of an existing stimulus. As for alterations in mood, the 4 participants reported both periods of euphoria and dysphoria. The researchers also noted that the participants seemed over-controlled, meaning they appeared somewhat emotionally inhibited. I personally think that this may have been an artifact caused by the fact that they were in a strange room with 4 doctors. I would absolutely be attempting to restrict how open I was about the experience I was having in that environment unless I really knew the doctors well and understood their motivation for the study. As for behavioral responses, 2 of the participants described feeling relaxed and sleepy, and the other 2 wanted to move and be active. There was one participant who was a piano player, and when he tried to play the piano, because apparently that was also in the room, they described his playing as buoyant but unnatural. The participant described the experience by saying that he, quote, felt as though he were 2 measures ahead of himself. The researchers then go on to report that speech appeared either slow and slurred or rapid and frenzied, and that a similar disturbance was noted for attention and other aspects of cognition. 3 of the participants judged time to be either moving too fast or too slow, but remained otherwise oriented to time, place, and person. Since we've talked about it in a few episodes now, I also wanted to point out that only one participant's pupils appeared maximally dilated in this study. It doesn't look like they made precise measurements, just sort of a were they or weren't they dilated observation. So I would take that finding with a grain of salt, but it might also be indicative of the lower dose. The last finding, and one that is unique to the study, is that they had participants perform the block design test. The block design test is one of the types of questions used during an IQ test, where you are shown a square pattern and then given tiny square blocks that each have a piece of the pattern on them, and are asked to assemble them so that they match the pattern you were shown. This test is used to assess spatial visualization and motor skills. What the researchers found was that all 4 of the participants had difficulty with this test, and apparently more so than participants in a separate study who did the same test after being given LSD. Now, they don't do a pretest before being given the drug, so it's possible that these volunteers would have had difficulty even before being given psilocybin. They also didn't report any quantitative assessment, like the time it took them to complete the test, so it's hard to interpret these findings. Nevertheless, this isn't the first study to report that psilocybin causes cognitive alterations that may truly be hindering performance on these types of tasks. Hopefully, we can learn more about this as we continue to go through the literature. We do know now that psilocybin influences activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is vital for many cognitive skills such as planning and decision-making, so these cognitive alterations are potentially consistent with how we think psilocybin acts on the brain. Well, that's it for today's episode. I know it's a bit shorter than usual, but as always, I really hope you loved the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas, please let me know. You can find out all of the ways to reach me on the website, Psychotogenic.org, where you can also find the full transcript for each episode if interested. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.